Welcome to Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell. This is the place where we dive into the world of talent acquisition, explore the challenges of today's workplace, and discover what it takes to build a thriving and successful organization.
I'm back with facilitator and speaker Elaine Lin Hering. During her career, she's worked with organizations and individuals to build skills in communication, collaboration, and conflict management. We're in the middle of discussing her new book, Unlearning Silence, which explores how we've learned to be silent, how we've benefited from silence, and how we've silenced other people. Now, Elaine, would you mind sharing some practical tips from the book on how to rediscover and use our authentic voices well?
Sure. Let's start with if you are wondering what your voice actually sounds like. And this was certainly my experience, having taught someone else's content, having channeled other causes. Many of us become very effective agents for other people. And then we start to wonder, do I even have a voice? Do I bring anything to the table, or am I just good because I am your right-hand person who makes your life easier? If you're wondering what your own voice is, I would actually start with some internal work, which is to say, ask yourself a question. What do I think? What do I need? Very simple questions, but pretty radical if you have been focused on solving for everyone else's problems. So the question is no longer, what would my manager want me to think? Or what the company would want me to think, but what do I, with my unique experiences and vantage points and identities and life experiences, think? Then you can decide whether you want to share any of that externally, but it at least reminds you that you have valuable perspectives. I'll also offer, for those of us who lead and are experiencing that frustrating dynamic of, I've asked them what they think and I get crickets. They're not saying anything to me. What else can I do? And we throw our hands up in frustration. So many of us with good intentions say, tell me what you think, or what do you think? And on the receiving end of that question, particularly with a power dynamic, that question feels like a trap. John, how honest do you actually want me to be? Right? I watched someone else tell you what they thought. They're not here anymore.
Yeah, that can definitely be threatening. Even if you're not in that situation, you see it's the combination of all that you've observed.
Exactly. So to me, more powerful is to ask standard questions and a pair of questions, meaning what are the pros of this idea? What are the cons of this idea? What about this idea works? What about this doesn't work? What concerns do you have? What about this resonates? And those standard questions do a couple of things. Number one, it trains people to expect, John is always going to ask these questions. This is just what we do. So there's no question of whether I have to raise dissent. Dissent and the invitation of a different perspective is baked into how we work around here. Second, we're all wired differently. Some people are real-time processors, figure things out best in the meeting. Some are post-processors. And so it's 20 minutes after the meeting that they're like, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, here's the light bulb goes off,
and
right?
We want those light bulbs, right? With those light bulbs
Sure.
have value. So it allows people to sort of pre-process to know, we're always going to answer these questions and I can be ready to offer my best thoughts rather than getting caught off guard. That's how we as leaders change culture to make sure we're also not just getting the highlight reel of life and build a culture of toxic positivity, but also what's not working here that we can solve for and course correct before things get worse.
Yeah. One of the things that I've found also helpful, and hopefully it's not a mistake, but so I many of my executive team and I have worked together for a while, and they know, we've that they can contradict and say, John, that's the stupidest idea I've heard. Let's do this instead. And so one of the techniques that I use is I share with others who might be newer or coming in or visiting the team saying, hey, look, I may share ideas. I don't need you to think of me as the one in charge. I'm just another voice sharing ideas. And the rest of this team gets that. So I'm telling you this because you're going to hear them say, what? No, we shouldn't do that. Let's do this. And so that takes time. And the way to short circuit that time is to actually sit there and say, you're going to see this back and forth. And that doesn't mean, that they're being disrespectful. Some of it was just familiarity that will allow us to do that. But you should participate as well.
I love that. And to me, that is controlling the narrative about how that behavior is experienced, right? Some people might say, what is happening on John's executive team?
Yeah.
Are they functional as a team? And you're
what's
saying,
going on?
This is actually how we function because we believe it is helpful and healthy. The other is a practice I often coach leaders to do, which is to tell strategic stories. Even if you say, we do this around here, if that's not our experience from our former workplaces, it's going to take some time to really test that. But if we can inject the story of the time that someone said, John, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard, and in fact, it was a better outcome because they said that, then you are building culture by inserting data points into someone's data set.
That's great. Good advice. So why is it so important, both personally and societally, for people to feel that they can speak up authentically?
So having to silence yourself keeps your nervous system on chronic high alert, which our bodies were not designed to do. Silence also means that we internalize the message that we're the problem. Everyone else seems to be fine. If you're the one who can't hack it, it must be me. And that contributes to that epidemic of loneliness that our Surgeon General has well researched. And so I've been really shocked at how often when we unlearn silence and start to talk about the things we're facing, there's a me too. Yeah. Oh, you struggle with that too? I thought it was just me, which allows us both to identify social patterns or policy issues within an organization to improve together rather than internalizing the message, it's just me. So if nothing else, I hope we're having more honest conversations about what's really going on, because internalizing the message leads to all of the burnout that so many of us have been experiencing, because not only are we not talking about it, believing that it's just us, but we're having to keep up this image that everything's fine when frankly, we're not all okay right now. And that needs to be okay.
We talked a little bit about how it negatively impacts the organization, but really as an individual, what do you see, or have you seen any studies that say, okay, if they continually do this, how does this impact them?
Yeah, this was one of the most painful parts of writing the book, not only because of my own story, but because I've coached so many women or people of color who are incredibly brilliant and who internalizing this message of I'm not enough, I'm an imposter. And, my favorite HBR article is Stop Telling Women That They Have Imposter Syndrome. And Ruchika Tulshan does a beautiful analysis of it's not that you're experiencing imposter syndrome, it's that the system wasn't built for you. But the more we internalize these messages, the more that it becomes a question of self-doubt, of thinking that we are less than, of not being able to bring forth the ideas, the talents, the skills that we have, and fundamentally not being able to be healthy.
Yeah. So you mentioned gender and race there. So what roles or do these factors like race, gender, and power dynamics play in who feels comfortable in speaking up?
Typically, people who carry dominant identities within an organization experience less of a barrier, less hesitation, less concern in speaking up, because your perspectives tend to be more normalized, right? If they're part of the dominant norm rather than minoritized, they're more normal. People who carry subordinated identities are more likely to be othered, to be challenged, to be left out of the conversation to begin with. Nilofer Merchant has a great statistic that if you're at less than 15% of the whole, then you are more likely to experience all of those things.
And that whole can be anything. I know. So I speak Japanese fluently, and I lived in Japan for a number of years, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm not a native speaker.
Yes.
And sitting in a meeting in Japan, until I feel comfortable, I don't want to speak up. So that, it's just like, yes, I know I could say this, but I'm not going to say it nearly as well. Let me just focus and listen, hear what everybody else is saying.
Yeah. Including, though, and this goes back to the calculation we were talking about, including when you speak up, how likely are you to be received versus John, doesn't matter how perfect your Japanese is. You're always going to be, well, you're John.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not Japanese, so
Yes. And is that okay? And can we still see the value of the perspective you bring, even if you're not Japanese, in that context? And of course, intersectionality, carrying multiples of these subordinate identities, only intensifies that dynamic.
complete disclosure, my experience in the Japanese culture is they're super excited that I've made any attempt to speak at all in their local language. So they're very accepting of that. But I'm just trying to use an illustration from my background, but that someone else might relate to. Going into a different culture,
Yes.
maybe having English as your second language if you're in the U.S. Leaders need to make the opportunity to not be silent more easy to accept and to open themselves to.
And one way that we as leaders can do that is to use our social capital. So often I hear people saying, my colleague came to me and said they're not invited to this meeting because English is their second language. We're not even talking about what hesitation they, as the English language person, might experience.
Just not allowed.
Right. You're just not allowed because it's uncomfortable for other people. It's too much of a hardship to listen to broken English, quote unquote. And people are saying, well, what can I do? Because I commiserate in private with them. And my challenge is always, well, what could you do in public? Rather than doing private commiseration, are you willing to say, you know what, John's English may not be the best, but he has the most detailed analysis on this issue I've ever heard. And I believe it's really important for us to hear it from him. How different of a framing and a reception for other people who might come with that different perspective or a bias toward English second language. Again, just one illustration of one identity, but also what can we do about it is to lend our social capital.
So if you find yourself in that situation where you feel like either you're being overtly or not overtly, you're feeling that you're in some way silenced, it could even just be a fear of speaking up. What, for people struggling to find their voice, what would be your advice on overcoming that fear or paralysis or that silence?
Yeah, a couple of things. Number one, to acknowledge that your fear is not unfounded. It's not something that you're just making up. There are real costs that I explore throughout the book to speaking up. So let's stop with that sort of debate internally of, is this okay for me to, am I wrong in feeling this? You feel how you feel, you experience the fears that you have, and there are really good reasons to it, and a cost-benefit analysis that only you can do. Second is that actually using your voice is not the absence of fear, but doing the calculation of, is it worth it? What is it that I might need to offer or say, or what impact do I want to have on the world that is more important to me? Chapter 6 and 7, talking about using your voice, starts with one anchor of start with why. What is your bigger why that makes it worth it despite fear or discomfort? And the third is that unlearning silence or using your voice is not a solo sport. So who might you invite onto your team as a sounding board? So many of us overthinkers spiral in our own thought process versus talking with someone to say, hey, hold up a mirror to me. You have an idea of what I care about, what I want to do in life. Is this crazy? What do you hear? Right? Processing through it, and for them to say, no, that makes sense, or try this. Having a team that can help you become the person you want to be. None of us can do it alone. I'd also say for those of us who are thinking, well, I don't have any of those people in my life. I don't have any trusted relationships, which is part of the problem. To me, this is the beauty of books who can lend a perspective, or a LinkedIn community. There's so many listen to a regular podcast that gives you that jolt of, there is something more than just my immediate world that may feel really narrow and within which I may feel isolated.
And as you talk about the third area, work with others, one other way that I've seen this happen, even at the executive level, is there are some people that are just more outgoing, willing to take those risks. And I've seen it where they'll all be in the same room, and that outgoing person will introduce someone else's idea. just to test it. So it takes away that first thing you talked about where this actually is a concern. So they test it. And then once it's like, oh yeah, let's discuss that further, then the originator of the idea feels more comfortable in speaking because they lost out on that risk factor. It disappeared because they're now, oh, they want to hear this. I have a lot more data. Let me speak up. So there can be a little tag teaming as well that I've seen that happens.
Completely. And one of the pieces of that dynamic is also, can we give credit where credit is due? So much of the challenge of
you bring it up. You didn't beat me down. By the way, that was so-and-so's idea. And I just need to let you know that they did a great job on this. And maybe they could give us a little bit more.
Yes. That is something I talk about in chapter 10 of forming coalitions. Nothing happens in isolation or solely by the effort of one person. So who in your stakeholder analysis could be useful in moving forward this idea? Whose strengths could you leverage? And together, you actually are stronger together. And that's not just a reference to the Golden State Warriors.
So we talked a little bit about how an individual can do that. What can leaders do to better create psychologically safe spaces where diverse voices are truly welcomed?
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this. One is leaders, do you recognize your own defaults and habits? Do you recognize that this could be
What's your bias? Yeah.
Absolutely. Do you recognize this could be challenging for someone else, even if it's not challenging to you? The other is to acknowledge the truth that power is invisible to those who have it. So often I coach C-level execs who are like, my hands are tied, or the CEO says the board won't let me. And we focus on the power we don't have versus the power we do have. And we are not clear about how our positionality, me being the CEO, impacts someone who does not have that same title. And the other reality I'd couple with that is we tend to default to the preferences and habits that serve the people with the most organizational power. So of course, in our system, we should optimize for the CEO's prime time or do it in a time zone that makes sense for them. And we tend to communicate by default, not by design. And that often narrows the perspectives we can hear and that can be heard. So to me, the prescription is to actually design the way we communicate. Are the avenues of asynchronous communication, of written communication, just as valid, just as celebrated, just as heard as real-time communication in prime time zone? And that to me is a 2-minute conversation analysis that so often unlocks talent and unlocks ideas that otherwise get sidelined.
So I want to go back to this idea of biases or blind spots that leadership might have, or anyone for that matter, when silencing someone. How can we become more self-aware about these biases or blind spots that cause us to dismiss some voices?
This question feels a little bit like a trap. I'll just name that because I think my answer is read the book.
Okay, so for those of you listening, the book is Unlearning Silence, and you'll get all the answers you need about how to overcome your biases.
Thank you. It feels awkward to do some product placement, but really, I wrote the book. The book is structured in 2 sections, awareness and action, 5 chapters each. And I really wrestled with, is this a book for people who struggle with speaking up? Or is it a book for leaders who might not experience that struggle? And, books are not supposed to be for everyone. And yet a holistic analysis, an honest conversation about silence requires each of those levers, self, leader, and culture. And so the invitation really is, so often leaders say, let me put it in my own context. People have said, Elaine, tell me what it's like to be an Asian American woman in corporate America. And I'm like, it's 2024. Go Google it. Right? Because the emotional labor to relive my experiences, to tell my story, however useful it could be to you, it's an ask of the people in your life to share their story. And also going back to the agency, particularly with power dynamics, are you asking me to do this work that you could otherwise do yourself? So I've at least now put it in book form. You can read it in hardback or ebook or Audible if you're not sick of my voice and want the narration, but really trying to highlight. And that's what chapter 5 of the book does and chapter 9 of the book does is here are 9 ways that leaders tend to silence other people. Use it as a checklist to say, as a leader, do I do any of these things? And chapter 9 for the action-oriented is, what do I do instead? What are those tactical pieces, like the questions I could ask instead?
So to be clear, you actually focused on both audiences in the book. You didn't want to just say, okay, wait for the second book, you other audience.
No, because I then would fall into the trap that most of the advice and most of the books now have fallen into, which is to say, go find your voice, use your voice, have more courage, have more confidence, fix yourself, without acknowledging the reality that our lives are all too intertwined. And by the way, we play both roles. That's where we started. We both silence ourselves and we silence other people.
That's right. We all play both roles, it to varying degrees, but we all sit in both of those chairs, wear both of those hats, whatever you want to talk about it as.
Whether at work or at home.
Last question. In your vision of the future, where all feel free to speak more openly and share their voice and quell their, I'll just call it harmful silence, where they're just not they're holding back value. What would our workplaces and society look like in that future?
It's a world and a workplace in which we can all thrive. That the energy that goes toward figuring out if I need to tiptoe around them or whether I need to censor here actually just goes into doing the work, into brainstorming, into delivering the product. And there's an efficiency to it. Instead of having to do the workaround because I'm worried about what John's going to think, so I'm going to go through 3 different stakeholders, I could actually just have a conversation with John. And given what he said, that it's okay to tell him if it's a stupid idea, and his actions actually back that up, what a novel idea that there's actually greater freedom and less energy spent on navigating the pervasive influence of silence and more just being able to get to do the work and do good work together.
I love that. In my book, I talk about, I have a whole chapter on just, diversity in hiring and keeping people and how that, changes the culture. But this is another aspect of, people, there's so many different types of diversity. And the more inclusive we can be and bringing all the voices together, the better solutions we end up with. And so this is, those who are uninhibited to speaking up versus those who feel inhibited is another aspect of diversity. And when people don't show up bringing their whole selves and you don't provide an environment where that can happen, everybody's missing out. I mean, we all lose. So, when we can sit there and say, hey, instead of leaving that aspect of my life at home or at the door when I walk into the office or my virtual office, if you will, we just, I think the end product is the richer for the diverse view.
And the culture that we're creating together, right? A culture of voice, a culture of getting to be, of getting to do good work together instead of spending that energy elsewhere.
Elaine, thank you for spending some time with us. Everyone, pick up Unlearning Silence. It will help us find another way to improve our workplaces and just improve our overall well-being. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that will do it for this week's episode of Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to subscribe so you can get notified of new episodes. Also, if you could spare a minute, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review to help others like yourself discover the show. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.
This has been Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you want to empower your organization to reach new heights, go to johnwmitchell.com to find the techniques and tools you need to attract and retain the best team and boldly reimagine your workplace. Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell is a production of Forbes Books.